Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I am a little bit under the weather today, unfortunately, so I'm going to be sharing my hosting duties with Emily Petrucci, a wonderful research assistant in my lab. But I want to say some words at the outset here, um, both in regards to the center and our distinguished speaker for today. Um, First of all, Dr. Amishi Jha is really one of the seminal thinkers in the field of mindfulness research. I'm sure some of you are very well aware of that. She's also recently come out with a new book, Peak Mind, and has been doing a lot of research on the capacity of mindfulness training to affect attentional measures, both cognitive performance measures and some related brain correlates. And has also done some really seminal work in helping to just kind of define what we're talking about when we speak about mindfulness at the phenomenologic level. So it's really just such a pleasure to have you here today, Dr. Jha, and looking forward to your talk, albeit in a somewhat compromised state personally. And I do want to just say a couple of words about a few of the other things we have coming up. One, we have a standing call for proposals for students, grad students, and even postdocs, just to pilot proposals that are, if you just go to the Center for Mindfulness Science website, you will see the call for proposals. The due date is in about a month and a half or so. We'll also have a couple of additional speakers coming up in the next month. Dr. Nicholas Van Dam in about 2 weeks on February 23rd, and Zindel Siegel on March 23rd. So please do join for those as well if you're interested. And lastly, we're having a faculty retreat on March 27th, Sunday, March 27th. And the folks with Insight LA have been kind enough to offer us their retreat center in Benedict Canyon, and we'll be doing some practice as well as really getting into some discussion about some future plans for ways that we can coordinate the flowering of mindfulness research here at USC. So if you're a faculty and interested in that and hadn't yet heard about it, please do check our website. There's info there as well. And the very last thing I'll say about those upcoming things, we do also have a mindfulness research workshop being led by Randy Semple and Matthew Goodman, two of our steering committee faculty members. And this is really geared towards students who don't have a lot of firsthand experience in setting up research projects and want to get into mindfulness research. So it'll be a 4-session workshop over the course of 4 successive Tuesdays, starting in March. You can check that out on the website as well. Okay, so without further ado, thank you again so much, Amishi, for being with us today. And I'm going to turn it over to Emily to give your more formal and full introduction. And I will be signing off for now.
Thank you, Rael. All right. Dr. Amishi Jha is the Director of Contemplative Neuroscience and Professor of Psychology at the University of Miami. Prior to her current post, she was an assistant professor at the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania. She received her BS in Biological Psychology at the University of Michigan and her PhD in Psychology, specifically in Cognitive Neuroscience, from the University of California, Davis. And her postdoctoral training was at the Brain Imaging and Analysis Center at Duke University in functional neuroimaging. With grants from the Department of Defense and several private foundations, she leads research on the neural basis of attention and the effects of mindfulness-based training programs on cognition, emotion, resilience, and performance in education, corporate, elite sports, first responder, and military contexts. Very exciting. In her laboratory research at University of Miami, she uses fMRI, electrophysiological recordings, and behavior analysis techniques to understand why our attention sometimes fails us and if it can be trained for greater focus and less distractibility. She launched the first ever study to offer mindfulness training tools to active duty military service members as they prepared for deployment. What she discovered is that without intervention, attention is compromised and attentional lapses increase. Yet, with mindfulness training, attention can be strengthened and protected. In addition to her own published body of research, her work has been featured in many outlets, including TED.com, NPR, and Mindful Magazine. In addition, she has been invited to present her work to NATO, the UK Parliament, the Pentagon, and the World Economic Forum. In her forthcoming book, Peak Mind, which is in the background there, she shares her discoveries on how attention can be trained for optimal performance and well-being. We are truly honored to have you, and you can take the stage.
Thank you so much, Emily. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you. And I'll just say, because I didn't catch if you mentioned that, Emily, that if you do have questions during the talk, please just put them in the chat box or the question and answer box at the bottom, and we will pass them along to Dr. Jha at the end of the talk. So,
All right, now you rest.
thanks.
All right, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the warm introduction. Emily did a very nice job with that. Thank you. And of course, Rael, I've been a big fan of yours for many, many years, and I'm just so thrilled about the work that you're doing, and especially the center that you're really helping spearhead and place on the map. Just want to mention that at the University of Miami on the other coast, we have the U Mindfulness Initiative. So I think we should do some kind of bi-coastal retreat at some point. I'm just going to put it out there. But it's my great pleasure to be with all of you today. And as Emily mentioned, the work that I want to share with you is really sort of a summary or overview in some sense of the kind of work my lab has been up to for, gosh, the last couple of decades. And what I'll aim to do through our time together is place where I think this work fits within the larger context of mindfulness. And then, of course, I'm really looking forward to a conversation together, given the variety of interest I'm sure that all of you represent. So I'm going to share my slides. Let's make sure everybody can see.
Yes, we can see.
Excellent. Okay. So the title of my presentation today, Strengthening Attention and Working Memory with Mindfulness Training. And this is essentially a summary recap of what Emily already beautifully and, of course, embarrassingly said about me and my work. So I'm just going to give the highlights here that essentially my formal training and my sort of foundational orientation is as a cognitive neuroscientist. I am very interested in how attention works in the brain, and that's the primary attention and working memory are the primary cognitive systems that we explore and examine in my lab. And we use a variety of techniques, functional MRI, EEG, ERP recordings, and I'll talk about some of that work today, and then performance measures of attention and working memory. And after doing this for many years, what we realized is that there are certain things that actually make these very powerful brain systems vulnerable. I've listed 3 here: stress, poor mood, and threat. And it was this combination of understanding the power of attention, yet its vulnerabilities, that really motivated me to want to explore solutions to being able to strengthen and protect this brain system. And I will say that it was not my intention going into this work to study mindfulness, but I'm very happy that it ended up that I could. In fact, I didn't know much about mindfulness, frankly, from a research point of view, because when I started this work, there wasn't a lot known about mindfulness and attention. So it's been a thrill to be able to initiate some of this work and have a whole group of amazing colleagues, including this wonderful center now at USC, to join in the effort to explore the topic of mindfulness training as one of the ways in which we can bolster and optimize our functioning and well-being, and in particular for the work in my lab, understand how it is that mindfulness training may protect attention, which we need for almost everything we do. So, given the vulnerabilities that we see in these various functions, you'll see that really relate to the kind of populations that we focused on in my lab. But before I begin in getting into the weeds on any of the work, I wanted to mention and really honor that mindfulness training itself is such a broad and diverse topic of investigation. In fact, it thrills me, the kinds of different studies and different perspectives that are being taken. And of course, mine is just one of many perspectives. So I just wanted to mention that I will be coming from this cognitive neuroscience perspective, really applying the lens of somebody who studies and explores the functioning of attention and working memory to see how it is that this training program or variety of training programs may be able to relate to the topics of attention and working memory. And since I'm the only one you're really seeing here on the screen, there's so many people and so much support that allows me to be able to say anything I'm saying to you today. I always want to begin by really honoring my team, my collaborators, our funders and advisors who allow me to present the work to you today. And I've featured some of the pictures of the kinds of groups that we've had the opportunity to work with over our many years of doing this research. And in words, I've captured it here, images on the last slide. Really, we emphasize and study groups that we'd consider high demand cohorts. And sometimes I'll say high stress or high demand cohorts. And what I mean by that, well, frankly, anybody listening to my voice right now, watching this, we're all high demand cohorts. In some sense, it's people who want to function at their best. They are interested in having what they do matter. But as you can see, sometimes that takes it to the extreme where it matters so much that if there is a lapse, there could be a problem, not just for them, but for others. What we do is always situated within some kind of cultural container and context in our professional lives. That's true for academics and really even within subfields of academia, but that's true for many other professions as well. And I know most of you will share this next point number 4, time pressured. There is limited time for us to do a lot of what we want to get done. So keep these kind of features in mind, this is sort of the landscape of what I'm talking about. And of course, when I began this work many years ago, I had no idea that we would all collectively be in this sort of high demand, high stress interval, which is what the last few years of the pandemic have actually done. So at some level, that's what I mean by all of us collectively, globally, are in some kind of high demand interval right now with a lot of volatility, uncertainty, ambiguity regarding what's going on. And I'm hoping we'll see some light at the end of that tunnel. But in particular, I wanted to mention that we not only work with groups that we consider high demand, high stress professionals, but we really want to work with them in the most demanding circumstances that they may encounter. So for example, military service members, as Emily mentioned, one of the groups that we've worked extensively with, we want to work with them during pre-deployment, readiness and field training, and deployment itself when the demands are very, very high. And one of the reasons we want to do that for all the groups that we work with is that because it seems to us, and as we'll talk about in detail throughout this lecture, those are the circumstances in which it's sort of two sides of the coin. On the one hand, attention is absolutely critical. Lapses, like I said on the side here, could be deadly. They're consequential. Decisions are consequential, and lapses could be deadly. And on the other hand, you need to perform at your best. So when it really counts, we want to be able to provide people with some way to bolster their attention. And at the same time, the circumstances of what high demand intervals comprise are the most likely to deplete or degrade attention. And I'll unpack that as we go forward. But just for you to get a sense of the kinds of groups that we work with and the kinds of populations that I'll be talking about with our research, from military service members, first responders, elite athletes, and so on. And as academics, many of you are working within the academic setting. The academic semester itself can be a kind of high stress, high demand interval. In fact, we've seen many experiments in which we can track the costs on attention for people traversing the academic semester. So keep this in mind with regard to the populations that we're talking about. And what I want to do is talk about essentially 3 main questions that'll anchor sort of the journey of this presentation. The first is, a broad question regarding what makes attention and working memory vulnerable. These, I'll talk more about what they are, but these are powerful brain systems. What really does cause them to become compromised? And given that there will be vulnerabilities, can mindfulness training protect these cognitive systems? And then finally, given that we're going to pursue answering both of those questions, we want to land on some notion of best practices, not just in general, but in particular for high demand, high stress, time pressured cohorts. So keep that in mind. And by the way, as an attention researcher, I know that it's very likely that your attention is going to lapse during this talk. 35 to 50% of our waking moments are mind wanders. So I always like to give my bottom line up front and give you the take home message now so that you know sort of the final destination for the journey of the talk. I encourage you to still please follow along as best you can. But this is where we're going. So when it comes to what makes attention and working memory vulnerable, we'll talk about a series of studies that my lab has conducted, specifically looking at the deleterious effects of negative distraction and mind wandering. So external distraction, internal distraction that compromise attention and working memory. And we'll talk about it at the performance level and at the neural level. When it comes to mindfulness training, yes, it does indeed look like mindfulness training can protect against degradation that can be experienced over high demand intervals in the kinds of groups that we work with. And finally, we are triangulating on a prescription of best practices as it relates to time pressured groups. And I've described some of the features of those here, something like 4 weeks, 8 hours of formal training with a trained trainer with about 12 to 15 minutes of daily practices 3 to 5 times a week. The other really important key piece that we'll come to understand is that the training itself has to be context relevant for many of these professional settings in which it's offered. And the trainer must also have familiarity with that context. So that's where we're headed, but please stay with me throughout the journey here. So let's just begin by talking about what it is that I mean when I say attention and working memory. I know that all of us probably have, whether you have expertise in this from the academic or scholarly perspective or not, you have a sense of what these terms may mean, but I'm going to unpack highlighting specific features of each of these systems. So when I say attention, obviously this is a very complex, multifaceted brain system. I'm going to hone in on selective and sustained attention. And I like to use the metaphor of a flashlight here. So if we were in a darkened room and we needed to be able to get around, maybe to find our way to the doorway, a flashlight would be a very handy tool. Whatever it is that that flashlight points or illuminates, we get crisp, clear information. Attention is the same way. Wherever we direct it, willfully direct it, or wherever it gets pulled, there's going to be a benefit to information processing for the information on which that spotlight of attention, if you will, shines. So it's selective, meaning some information is relevant and other information is not. You're only going to get the benefits where the flashlight is shining. You can actually direct it, meaning point the flashlight and redirect it as you will. Sometimes the flashlight will get yanked. That's also an important feature to keep in mind. And it has this capacity to sort of narrow almost to the point of laser focus or broaden out. So these are the features of this particular attention system, selective attention, sometimes referred to as attentional orienting, and there's aspects of executive functioning that'll also come up. And then on the other side, I'm talking about this metaphor for working memory, and I use this whiteboard image to describe that, really to place a metaphor. And it's really a whiteboard with sort of peculiar features, disappearing ink. And what I mean by this is that working memory is the ability to maintain and manipulate information over very short intervals. So we can think of it as a scratch space for our mind, this internally held whiteboard in which whatever we write on that whiteboard, so to speak, is what it is that we can have at the front of our conscious experience. And it's where we can manipulate information, work with it to use it as we need to. But that ink only stays on for a very limited period of time. It's going to vanish away. And then if we want it on the whiteboard, we got to write it again. So that's that peculiarity of its time limited ink on the whiteboard. It's also very important not just to maintain and manipulate information, but to really make sure that the relevant stuff that we need is really staying on this mental scratch space. We don't want irrelevant information to land on our whiteboard. It could really distract us and derail us. So we need to function in order to inhibit that kind of information. So I hope that these two systems, you can see how they're sort of cousins to each other. They need to work together. Wherever it is that flashlight of attention shines, helps get information onto the whiteboard. And these processes are critical for literally every single complex thing that we have to do. From our ability to think, meaning follow a train of thought, deliberate decisions, learn, plan, etc. Our ability to feel and regulate our emotions, as well as our ability to connect with other people. So I really see attention and working memories fueling our ability to be successful and function in the world. This is why it's so critical that we protect it, that we keep it available for us to use for these multiple purposes. So what do we know about the benefits of attention regarding functioning? As I mentioned, this flashlight metaphor actually turns out to be quite similar to what we see when we look at the brain basis for attention. And in particular, for selective attention, we see the impact of directing attention on the earliest stages of perception. So we see that there's improved perceptual processing within a few hundred milliseconds of directing our attention to something in our environment, for example. And we see it with a variety of brainwave components, ERP components, from early visual perceptual components like the P100 and N100. And then, of course, the work that I'll talk about today is going to emphasize the N170, which is a face sensitive component happening around 170 milliseconds after a face is perceived in the environment. We also know, in addition to perception, that, of course, attention is critical for action. As I mentioned, action could be internally held action, like thinking, or our ability to engage and interact with the world. And performance is better on tasks when we are paying attention versus when we are not. So let's talk about now, that's sort of the power of attention and the benefits of attention. Now let's talk about the vulnerabilities of attention and how we can introduce these vulnerabilities in these controlled laboratory environments where we're manipulating the nature of the vulnerability so that we can see the impact on attention, the kinds of costs that may arise to the attentional system. And we're in the Olympics right now, and of course nobody's sitting in the stands and cheering the athletes, but I do like kind of thinking about athletes as an example of people that have to deal, in most cases, with external and internal sources of distraction while they're actually performing. So if we think of sort of typical circumstances when there may be teams dueling each other on some kind of, let's say, football field, and there are sources of distraction in our external environment. It could be crowd noise, they could be cheering or booing, depending on what side, I guess, they're rooting for. And then, of course, there's internal sources of distraction. Something we'll talk about is mind wandering, having off-task thoughts during an ongoing task or activity. And this is an example would be a rumination over a bad play that somebody, as an athlete, him or herself, may have engaged in. So let's start out by seeing how we're going to actually test out the vulnerabilities of attention as it has to do with external sources of distraction. And as I said earlier, we're talking about, in the larger sense with my lab's research, people that will face real world external distractions, athletes, service members, medical and nursing professionals, or students. And we want to see what the consequences of those are. So I want to share with you now a study that we did, actually a couple of studies that we've done on using brainwave recordings, ERP recordings, in which we're getting a sense of what the benefits of directing attention are on the earliest stages of perceptual processing and the vulnerabilities to the benefits of attention. And in particular, we're going to use a complex type of stimulus that's relevant for real-world behavior, human faces. The first question that we want to ask is whether it is the case, as other studies have seen, and we want to confirm that that's the case here too, if let's just say it the way I've written it here, are face-sensitive ERP components modulated by attention to faces? Now, we'll unpack what that means. And the second question will really mean is really focusing in on, if that's the case, does external distraction type, meaning negative or neutral distractors, influence the magnitude of that modulation? So let's now see how we're going to test this out. So the first question regarding whether it is the case that we can, the broadest way to say the question is, can we examine and find that there is benefit to the earliest stages of information processing for complex stimuli like faces. And if there is a benefit, we might see it in the amplitude modulation of face-sensitive perceptual neural signatures, or face-sensitive ERPs. So here's an example of the kind of stimulus you might see if you were invited into the lab to do this study. I hope that you can make it out on your screen. It should look like two kind of images, one on top of the other. You should see a face, and then you should see something that looks like a building or a home. And what we do is we show a series of these images over and over again, and we block the instruction conditions. On some of the instructions, we'll say, for the next series of trials where you see face after face after face, focus on the face and answer some categorical question regarding the face. So it could be something regarding the affect. Is the face happy or sad? It could be gender, male, female, whatever it is, something categorical to ensure that the decision that they're making is regarding the domain we've asked them to attend to, in this case, focusing on faces. And then, of course, on other trials, same kind of face house overlays, we're going to manipulate it so that they're paying attention, asked to pay attention to the scene and answer categorical judgments about the scene. Is it indoor or outdoor? So in this case, it would be an outdoor scene because we're looking at a house from the outside. So by doing this and having them press and indicate to us with responses, we'll be able to tell that they're paying attention to the right domain and that they're performing the task accurately. Our interest, of course, is not just knowing that they're doing the task as we instruct, but looking at the earliest perceptual effects of attention. And so the first good news is that we have a component, as I mentioned earlier, that is face sensitive, occurs very early in visual information processing, and we'll be indexing that. But this is, I think, just a refresh of what I just said. But we're going to take it one more level. So you're going to see faces over and over again. Sometimes you're going to be asked, face scene overlay images, I'm sorry. You're going to be asked to attend to the faces in some blocks and attend to the scene in other blocks and answer these categorical judgments. And then what we do is sort of a twist on this, which is we're going to also have another manipulation, which is totally task irrelevant distractor images that we will impose, interleave between these faces, face house overlays that you see. And we'll block it so that some of those blocks will be neutral images that'll just show up every now and then. This is a spoon, which is a neutral image. Sometimes it'll be negative images picked from the IAPS negative image battery that'll be just embedded within this series of face house overlay stimuli. And again, the task is the same. Categorical judgments for faces when it's the attend face block, and scene when it's the attend scene block. They know they're going to get all neutral trials or all negative trials that are coming up as distracting images. Okay, so what happens? Well, the first thing to say, as I was saying a moment ago, is that we know what we're looking for. We're going to look to see what happens to this face-sensitive ERP component known as the N170 that happens, like I said before, 170 milliseconds after a face is shown on the screen. And in particular, we're going to look to see if attention to faces modulates this component. And the good news is we do see that. And I show that on the next slide. So look under this, look under the distractions, neutral distraction side of the screen. If we had no distraction at all, we'd see something very similar. The N170 component to this face scene overlay image is larger in amplitude, greater in amplitude when we pay attention to the face than when we pay attention to the scene. Now think about that. The actual stimulation on the screen, the actual stimulus is the same under both of these conditions. It's only where attention is directed that differs. And when it is the case that this attention is directed to the face, we see that difference in amplitude, which is what we consider to be attentional modulation, a benefit to a certain category of stimulus that this particular component is already sensitive to. But the key thing here for our purposes is not just to see this, we've seen this in many other studies, but to see what the impact of these distractors are on the magnitude of attentional modulation. And what you can see is when the distraction is neutral, we get a sort of a typical effect where attention benefits face processing when attention is directed to the face. But when we make this slight tweak where the task is the same, the face scene overlay images are the same, all we did is once in a while embed negative images into the stream, and they're totally task irrelevant, we see a dissolution, a dissolving of that attentional modulation. So already in the context of this highly controlled laboratory setting, we're seeing the presence of negative distraction disrupts typical attentional performance and the benefits of attention. Now, that's not great news, because the kinds of images we're talking about here are things that you might see on your nightly news show, or even anytime you might be scrolling through your news feed. These are very, very typical things that we can see over and over again, and it will dissolve or diminish attention's power to modulate early perception. So two pieces of the two questions answered. Yes, we do see a modulation. And yes, there is an impact of the type of distraction. We're only seeing preservation of attentional modulation for neutral but not negative stimuli that are distractors. So now what about when we have internal distraction? Now, of course, in a laboratory context, it's very hard to impose internal distraction. First of all, it's distraction, so it should be task irrelevant, and it needs to be internally generated from within the person. So how do we do this? We struggled for a long time trying to figure it out, and then we realized if you want people to generate internal distraction, all you need to do is make the task really boring, and they're happy to just generate away. So we essentially did that. We designed a very boring a task, still tapping into ERP components of face processing. But now what we want to do is promote mind wandering, task irrelevant thoughts that may come up. And we want to be able to determine if that's occurring by probing the ongoing experience of the participants as they're doing the task. So let me just describe the task for you here. Now, most of these studies, I think almost every study that I'm going to show you is already published. If you want more details, feel free to check them out on our website. So what happens, this is essentially a standard sustained attention task. You're going to see a face on the screen. Every time you're going to see a face, press a button, except when that face is upside down. That's what we call a target, which is kind of interesting because you're not pressing a button then. These target faces that are upside down occur infrequently, about 5% of trials. So people get pretty bored. They sit there, they're pressing, there's a little delay, they press again. They get in this autopilot mode and they start mind wandering a lot. They usually will press to the target and then followed by some kind of expletive like, oh, I didn't mean to do that. Every now and then with this continuous stream of stimuli, we'll stop the experiment and we'll ask a couple of questions that'll allow us to see the nature and kind of characterize the extent of which mind wandering may be occurring. So the first question was just, where was your attention right before this probe appeared? And it'll either be on task or off task. In this particular experiment, we asked it categorically. In others, we've kind of given them a Likert scale. And then we ask questions regarding confidence. So what I'm going to focus on is just the question regarding on task or off task to see what the impact is of mind wandering on perception of faces. So again, these are all faces, and all we're looking at here is the face, the N170 to upright faces, meaning not the upside down target faces. So these are upright faces. When the probe response that followed said that yes, I was definitely on task or I was off task, meaning my attention was not in the task at hand. And what we see should look very familiar to you, like the attentional modulation that we manipulated in the last study. When people are on task, the N170's amplitude is larger than when they are off task. Now, we didn't manipulate whether they were on task or off task. They chose when they were going to fly away, meaning their attention was going to go somewhere else other than the task. But we see it in this very early face perceptual component. So what this describes to us is that, as others have described as well, faces and other types of stimuli, their perceptual processing will be compromised when the mind wanders away. It's a phenomenon called perceptual decoupling, where attention is not available to fully process stimuli when there is internal distraction, if you will, when there is mind wandering. The other thing we notice is, as shown on the other side of the slide, the ICV, is that their response time is much more variable, meaning the way in which they're pressing the button is a lot more variable when they're off task versus on task to those non-target faces. So we see it both in the performance and in the brain response that there's a compromised functioning that occurs when mind wandering is present. So both of these examples have shown us that external distraction with those negative images and this internal distraction with mind wandering is that perceptual processing is compromised. We don't get the power and benefit of attention, and performance can become compromised when there is distraction. So I was going to tell you more about now just another series of studies, and this will go fast, where we looked at very similar questions with working memory, not sustained attention tasks. So in this experiment, it's very similar to what I showed you with that first experiment with negative and neutral images, but now we're providing these task irrelevant distractors in the context of a working memory task. And a working memory task, again, it's maintaining and manipulating information over very short intervals, just a few seconds here. What happens in this experiment is a standard delayed recognition experiment. You're presented with, in this case, two faces. They disappear, and you are to maintain the identity of those faces internally in your internal whiteboard, if you will. And then, after some period of time, a probe appears, and you're asked, is this the face, one of the faces you were asked to remember? If it is, you press yes. If it's not, you press no, and then you go on to the next trial. So the working memory part is really the maintenance of encoding the faces, and then the maintenance of what's going on in the delay, holding those faces in mind, and then responding to that probe. It's during that maintenance phase that we actually present these task irrelevant distractors. There's nothing that they're supposed to do to them, but the images are, again, neutral or negative. And what we see, this is just an example of one of many studies that have been done in this, is that performance is worse when those distractors are negative versus neutral. And we really did try our best to equate for the visual complexity of those distractors. So this is just important to keep in mind. In the same way that attention suffers as a function of negative versus neutral distraction, so too does working memory. We did another study in which we looked at internal distraction with working memory. And what we did this time is essentially a standard delayed recognition task. No distractor was presented in that delay interval. Remember faces, there's a delay. Tell us when you see a probe face if it was one of the ones you were asked to remember. But then every now and then, just like that sustained attention task I was telling you about, we will pause the experiment and ask a couple of probe questions. Where was your mind right before you got this probe? So where was your attention focused on average during the last trial? And this was a Likert scale where they said it was very much on task or very much off task. And what I'm showing you in sort of cartoon form here is that essentially there is a cost to mind wandering, once again, on working memory in the same way we saw for the attentional task. When people report being on task, their performance is quite good, but the more they say that they were off task, their performance tends to get worse. So again, working memory's accuracy is lower when there is external distractibility, as the last experiment, and internal distractibility. So this just brings us to our first point, and I really wanted to emphasize that, we know about these facets and vulnerabilities of attention from these types of highly controlled laboratory studies that we've done and others have done that shows us that there are many things that attention and working memory become vulnerable by, but these are two potent sources: negative distraction and mind wandering. They compromise perceptual processing of information, the earliest stages of attentional modulation, as well as performance. So why is this important for this broader story regarding mindfulness and mindfulness training? Why would I be starting there? Well, it relates to the kind of groups that we're going to be talking about for the rest of my talk here. And, the first thing you might say is, okay, if these things are vulnerable, if these systems are vulnerable and very powerful, can we protect them? Can we actually protect against the vulnerabilities caused by these types of internal and external sources of distraction? And why do I think that this is important? Well, because again, my work goes from the basic and the kind of foundational science to really applied settings. And what we know is that for all of these different types of groups, there is evidence in the literature, including our own examples from our own work, that high demand intervals have these features of having a lot more negative mood and more mind wandering occurring over periods. Now I'm talking about periods from weeks to months in which the demand is intensive and protracted. And these are, of course, not experimentally created high demand intervals. These are all part of the sort of professional landscape that people in various professions will encounter. So we're not having to go in and manipulate, making it demanding. It just will be. And what we know about these intervals is that it has both of these features, which leads us to predict that, yeah, probably if we now go in and look at attention, given that it has a lot of negative stimuli that will be encountered and prone to mind wandering or attentional hijacking, attention may become compromised. And then, of course, if attention is compromised, the consequences could be quite problematic for the performance that people have to engage in across these high demand intervals. And indeed, it is the case that when we track people in terms of their attentional performance on experiments like the sustained attention response task, or the working memory types of experiments that I was describing to you, and we test them once at the beginning of some kind of high demand interval, and then many weeks later, 4 to 8 weeks later, again in the same exact set of tasks, we see a significant decline in their performance if we do nothing at all, meaning we're not intervening, we're just observing the nature of what happens to attention over high demand interval. Now, when I say high demand interval, I mean the academic semester, pre-deployment training, readiness training, things like hurricane season, fire season, medical school, residency. There's so many examples where we'll see degradation in performance, in attention, and working memory over these intervals. That little dotted line I'm showing is just an example of what would happen if these same types of populations were tested in an interval that was not high demand. So for example, undergrads tested when they're not in the academic semester over the summer, for example, they'll show a stability in these in the task performance on these tasks. So it's not that the tasks are prone to varying over time. There is a stability in the internal reliability is good, but over high demand, we'll see a degradation in their performance. So now we know that attention is vulnerable. It actually will be compromised. And the features of these high demand intervals have the makings of what we already knew from our laboratory-based work that are likely to degrade attention. So unfortunately, the puzzle pieces do fit together, which of course brings us to kind of wanting to connect the dots now to the topic really at hand, mindfulness training. Negative mood and mind wandering degrade attentional performance. So how are they doing this? We've shown you that they do. I've shown you that they do through the studies. And I just now want to kind of take you more to the phenomenological of your experience when you yourself might be in a particular negative mood, or when you're experiencing mind wandering. So really all of this hinges on something that the mind is very, very powerfully, the human brain at least, is very, very powerfully able to do, that actually may be driving why we see these vulnerabilities in attention. And that powerful thing is something we might broadly call mental time travel. So we know as human beings that we have the capacity to displace ourselves in time, and frankly, even in the mindset that we're in. We can be in somebody else's mind, so we can mind travel and we can time travel. And I use this sort of metaphor of an MP3 player to kind of describe what I mean there. So we can very easily rewind the mind. And when we do this, it's very useful. We can productively reflect on the past, learn from it, etc. Or we can fast forward the mind to plan for the future. Again, seamless to do, very easy to do, and very powerful and beneficial. So I'm by no means trying to say that mental time travel isn't useful, but it ends up that while it has its utility, under protracted periods of high demand, things start to go a little bit off. And what I mean by that is under high demand intervals, what we notice is that there's an increase in reporting of not just simply productively reflecting on the past when people rewind the mind, but they're ruminating more on past events. They're reliving and regretting events that have occurred. And when we're fast forwarding, we're not simply productively planning, but we're catastrophizing and worrying about events that frankly, haven't happened yet, but they may never happen. So now what's happening is that attention is no longer available to us. It is stuck unproductively in the past during rumination, or unproductively in the future when we are catastrophizing. This again is tied to what I mean by mind wandering, these off-task moments during whatever it is that we need to be doing in the moment. And we know that when there is mind wandering that occurs, errors occur, as I showed you in the last couple of studies. Information is missed. Even at the most fundamental levels of perception, there's a degradation of input. And we end up having difficulty making decisions. And we see that in the nature of this response time variability that's often observed in behavioral tasks. So the news is bad regarding mind wandering. And we already know that when that occurs, there's consequences that happen, not just for all these things that I've described, but many studies also report consequences for mood. In fact, one of the earliest papers by colleagues at Harvard that talked about mind wandering. The title of the paper was "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." So there's this notion of a yoking between attention being hijacked away from the present moment and consequences for performance as well as for mood. So this all leads us to maybe pondering, well, what can we do about this? If the mind has this tendency and will wander often, 50%, 35 to 50% of our waking moments, just the baseline. Under high stress, this will happen more and is characterized by more rumination and catastrophizing. What can we do, especially under high demand moments? Well, this is where mindfulness is so powerful. And in some sense, I would say the opposite of a wandering mind is a mindful one. And I really conceptualize mindfulness as keeping that button right on play. It's a mental mode characterized by attention to our present moment experience, being in the here and the now. But being in the here and the now in a particular way without conceptual elaboration or emotional reactivity. And other people have described this as with a non-judgmental orientation and curiosity. There's many different words for it, but essentially what we mean is not having a story about what is occurring, but really trying as much as possible in the way you're orienting to the experience to get the raw data, sort of the bare essentials of what's happening without an overlay of your concepts regarding what's happening. And this is an intrinsic capacity that all of our minds have. So when we're not mind wandering, we are actually mindful. Of course, what we want is not just to have this capacity, but to command it when we need it most, especially when the tendencies of mind are to ruminate or catastrophize. So the question is not just, can you be mindful, or maybe just be mindful as an instruction to yourself, but how can you train the mind to be more mindful? And of course, this is an enterprise that many of those that are listening to me are probably pursuing themselves. How do we offer mindfulness training so that it benefits people? And what we're attempting to do is bring more moments of this mindful mental mode into the person's experience. So, of course, I'm very fortunate at this point because there's so many researchers that have done this, and there's so many ways in which mindfulness has been offered. Probably the most well-studied, not probably, the most well-studied programs that are involved in offering mindfulness training to sort of community members are listed here: mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and mindfulness-based stress reduction. In fact, I'd probably flip the order, where MBSR, developed by John Kabat-Zinn, dear colleague, friend, mentor, many years ago, manualized this suite of practices and training to offer mindfulness exercises to individuals to cultivate more moments of mindfulness appearing in their lives. And what I'm showing here is really just what it means to engage in a program like this. Again, over 750 medical centers worldwide, probably much more than that at this point, but last count, offer programs like this, and they have these sort of general features. Like I said, they're manualized. They offer a suite of practices that really do promote exercising this mental mode, and they happen to have instructor-led courses that are between 24 or so hours. They occur typically around 8 weeks of time. And in addition to coming to class, and of course, I'm saying this to most of you who already are quite familiar with this, but I think it's just good to lay it out because it'll relate to what I'm going to talk about in a moment with the kind of groups that we work with. So 8 weeks, 24 plus hours, daily homework assigned is 45 minutes of practice. And there's quite a rigorous ramp up for instructor qualifications. And by the way, I think that this is fantastic. And the data on the benefits of mindfulness training, my MBCT and MBSR, is quite robust now, with many, many studies finding beneficial effects across many different areas. And so, I'm not saying that there's any problem with this. In fact, for people that suffer from chronic pain, psychological illnesses, the kind of stress and symptom reduction orientation of these programs is very powerful, because then mindfulness training can be applied in the context of stress reduction and symptom reduction. So it is the case that when we look at programs that are about this length with this sort of format, there are now well-established effects, beneficial effects for attention, working memory, and mind wandering. And I'm just showing a snapshot here because thankfully in our field now we're at the point where And I know you've Nicholas Van Dam coming up in a couple weeks, and he's been one of the people leading the charge on really trying to up level our rigor as scientists to make sure that our research studies are up to snuff, meaning we've conducted controlled trials and that we're not just relying on a study or two. We're doing meta-analyses, and we're doing meta-analyses of meta-analyses. So I'm showing you here just a snapshot of a couple of studies, some that have aggregated in our reviews and others that are meta-analyses. And the list would have been quite long if I had to be exhaustive, but know that there are many studies now that have shown that in community settings, people receiving mindfulness-based stress reduction, for example, a 8-week program with about 24 hours of training, show improvements in attention on the kinds of tasks that I've described, improvements in working memory, and reductions in mind wandering. And I'm not going to have time to tell you about it, but it's also the case that the brain basis for these improvements are being tracked so that we can look at brain networks involved in these various functions to see if engaging in the practices is making a difference in brain structure and function. And indeed, the picture is lining up that it looks to be the case. So all of this is essentially fitting together quite nicely. We can engage in mindfulness training. It has this beneficial effect of promoting a presence-centered mode. We can offer the programs to people and see improvements. But we now need to think about the context of the kinds of groups that we work with in my lab, and in particular, not just working with groups that tend to have high demands, but working with them in high demand intervals to see if we can protect against the kind of degradation we see in attention and in working memory over high demand intervals. So that's the next kind of question we want to ask is, well, that's great that in sort of community settings and healthcare settings, for example, where people may not be experiencing this protracted period of a demanding professional context, we see improvements above baseline. But what about these groups where essentially if we do nothing at all and we track them over a high demand interval, it's not going to be steady state with an improvement. There's going to be degradation, and we want to protect against that degradation. Do we see that? Well, I'm just laying out the predictions here. The prediction would be that whereas the control group, the group that got no training, we would see a degradation again. But the group that got mindfulness training, if it's having this salutary effect, may be able to protect against it, just to level it off so that we're actually maintaining functioning, not degrading. And it's possible that with even more commitment to the practices, we might see improvements even in people that are experiencing high demands. That's all part of what might be able to be witnessed. But I'm just showing you here that that's our prediction going in. We're not intending to necessarily see improvements beyond sort of a stability over time. And it's very rare that a researcher would, jump up and down to see, hey, look, I did something and nothing changed. But actually, in this case, it would really mean something because we know that if we do nothing at all by offering any kind of training, the chances are very, very likely that there'll be degradation in attentional functioning, in mood and stress levels increasing, poor mood increasing and stress levels increasing, mind wandering increasing, and probably on-the-job performance being negatively impacted, whether that's medical professionals having more medical errors or military service members and various types of first responders not responding appropriately and lapsing in their attention, which could be quite consequential. So that's what the project is that I'm going to tell you about in the last 10 minutes or so of my talk. And I want to just also mention that this is such a powerful manualized instructional tool for us of like how to offer training in a way that we can see repeatedly now benefits will arise. The challenge is this is a lot of time for people in time pressured settings. 8 weeks and 24 hours, 45 minutes a day. Most of us that live busy lives would be like, that's a lot, right? Especially if we're not attracted to these programs because we're suffering from a particular psychological or physical ailment, or we're not even identifying as really having stress in our lives. It's just my professional life that is, demanding. I don't even see myself necessarily as high stress. So we have to keep in mind that kind of cultural context in which the training would be offered to support these various professionals that we want to work with. So that's what I want you to kind of keep in mind, is that our project was to see how we might be able to offer training for the kinds of groups that we work with, given that they are incredibly time pressured and that it's a very different sort of set of expectations and framework that they're going to be using in order to motivate engagement in any kind of program. So there's three main questions that I want to kind of review with you, which is, it's kind of funny when you've got just a few slides to describe a decade plus of work, but I hope it gives you a sense of where we're at with our approach to these various things. And again, the intention going in is, let's see if there are actionable solutions. Let's move toward a best practice orientation. And that may mean that we have to think in terms of feasibility. We have to think in terms of maintaining the gold standard of research by having active comparison groups. And also, if we are successful, meaning that we can find feasible programs that are beneficial, scalability. How are we going to get this to more people? Because there are many firefighters and military service members and medical and nursing professionals that could benefit from this type of work. So all of those are what I'd like to talk to you about today. Let's start with sort of feasibility and the approach that we wanted to take. And again, the starting point for our journey was mindfulness-based stress reduction, whose prescription we knew, about 24 hours, 45 minutes a day. So what we did now in the context of studying a variety of different military groups is we said, let's keep our performance metrics the same, meaning let's look at attention and working memory along the lines of the kinds of experiments I described to you. And let's manipulate what we offer them in terms of the mindfulness training program itself, with an eye towards seeing what is most feasible and most beneficial with the least amount of time footprint for the group. Now, I just want to say at the outset that it's not that I think that people should not try to practice more or should practice more. In fact, I don't have a slide on this, but I'll tell you that in all of our studies, it is the case that the more people practice on a daily basis, the more they benefit. So more practice is beneficial. That is not an unknown. We know that from short-term training, like the kind of work that we've been up to, and longer-term training in terms of long-term practitioners. But the question is not so much, can you benefit if you practice mindfulness training? It's what's the least amount of footprint for a very busy organization that we might need in order to find a threshold of beneficial effects using metrics that we reliably know are stable over time in the laboratory context, and that longer form training tend to show improvements in. And by longer form here, I mean mindfulness-based stress reduction. So here's the approach we took. We worked with a variety of groups. This slide itself is probably about 8 years of work. And what we did is systematically across study, we varied various parameters. The first parameter was the number of hours with the trainer. So 24 plus hours around the time frame of MBSR over 8 weeks. And then we shifted so that we were reducing time. And of course, when we cut time, we have to cut content. So we were looking at things like, what should the emphasis be in the training? Should it be mindfulness exercises, like a workout that you might do with a personal trainer at a gym? Just show me the reps and let's do them together. Let's talk about my form, make sure I'm doing it correctly. Or should it be didactic information regarding the benefits of this type of practice, the costs of not doing this type of practice, etc.? And so partly what we were doing is trying to see if we can cut time, but cutting components, almost a dismantling approach. And what we found is that in our tasks of attention and working memory across multiple studies, we saw salutary effects with 24 hours, 16 hours, and 8 hours, 8 hours in particular when the emphasis was on mindfulness exercises taught by the trainer and emphasized in the training, not didactic content. But when we pushed it to 4 hours, things started falling apart. So formal time with the trainer of 4 hours, no beneficial effects could be recorded. Same thing with sort of not just the number of hours, keeping the number of weeks constant, but scrunching down the number of weeks from 8 weeks to 4 weeks. And again, when we went to 2 weeks, we could not track beneficial effects reliably in our cohorts. So this started giving us a picture of like, what is the approximate time frame where we might start seeing beneficial effects? And it's not on the slide, but I'll tell you that we also started looking at the number of sort of minutes of daily practice that we required. Triangulating in about requiring people to practice about 12 to 15 minutes a day based on many other preliminary studies that were done. So when it comes to feasibility, we are triangulating on a solution that's about 8 hours of training over 4 weeks with 12 to 15 minutes of daily practice. And this prescription ends up being something that many groups are much more willing to do than me saying I need about 8 weeks and 24 hours with 45 minutes a day of practice. That was for sure a non-starter with many conversations. This, at least, we can begin talking. And I can also make clear, because we've found the conditions that were too short, that if they don't have the time to do our a training program, we should not just cut them out of time, because probably it won't be beneficial in the settings that we're talking about. So that's that's our current thinking regarding prescription. Of course, all of these are active projects, but to date, this is where we're at. And the next thing I'd like to share with you is really the next question regarding comparisons with other forms of training. Because in most of these settings, when we came in and we said we want to offer mindfulness training, it wasn't always the case that they were already doing something with regard to improving attention, psychological well-being, or optimizing performance. So we wanted to make sure that just our beneficial effects that we were seeing weren't simply because we were doing something. Could have been anything, and it might have had beneficial effects. So to achieve this sort of gold standard of not just having a randomized design, but an active comparison condition, we were pursuing solutions and comparison conditions that were already sort of, these groups were warm to, in a sense. And a part of this comes from the psychological skills training and performance psychology literature. There are many groups that are already interested in offering performance psychology types of programs. So for example, things like relaxation training or positivity training. And so what I'm showing you here is essentially studies where we have now partnered with organizations and different kinds of groups, offered them the mindfulness training, but offered them a well-matched active control or comparison condition, I should say, not control, that highlighted relaxation training. So it would be 4 weeks of mindfulness training, 4 weeks of relaxation training, with homework that's the same, with a trainer that had the expertise. And then we wanted to see what would happen when we compared mindfulness to these other forms of training. And the key for me was that when I looked at these other forms of training, I was very aware that attention and attentional control are part of these programs. In fact, that's what a lot of performance psychology, psychological literature will talk about, is attentional control. And in some sense, it's control over the contents of what you're going to focus on, or control over the way in which you're going to engage attention. So I was curious to see what would happen to attentional task performance over time when we implemented programs that actually required you to spend out attentional fuel, if you will, attentional processing power, in order to engage in the types of practices that these programs required. So they were attentionally demanding themselves in some sense. So what I'm showing now is sort of a snapshot of characterizing what we ended up finding. And of course, please feel free to look at the actual studies themselves. So for the football team, which is the 2017 study where we had relaxation versus mindfulness, what we found was the mindfulness group. Well, let's start with the no training group. When there's no training, and it was actually across multiple studies, we've now seen this degradation over time. Those that engaged in relaxation training, unfortunately, looked no different than the individuals that we've seen across other cohorts that do not get training over high demand intervals. There was degradation. But the mindfulness training group looked stable in their attentional performance over time. And it was the case that we saw individual differences. So those that practiced more benefited more in this group. When we look at positivity, we see the same sort of thing, is that whereas the mindfulness training resulted in stability, positivity training actually looked no different than no training at all. Now I want to be clear here. I'm not trying to say relaxation and positivity are not beneficial. In fact, there's entire literatures on these. What I'm saying and what we're finding is that mindfulness training, relative to these other control conditions, comparison conditions, is preferred because of this particular context. Under high demand circumstances, in time pressured groups, it ends up that these programs, relaxation and positivity, in our hands are not beneficial. And it may be because of what I mentioned earlier, of the requirement to use attentional resources in order to do the kinds of processing that's required. And mindfulness doesn't seem to be working by the same mechanisms because it's not having the same kind of impact. In fact, it's looking to be protecting attention instead of depleting it. And so that's just sort of the recap. Mindfulness is protective, but relaxation and positivity are not in these high demand high stress intervals. And then finally, I just want to say a word regarding scalability, in that we're now really interested in seeing if these solutions are continuing to hold up, how can we scale up the availability of trainers that can deliver it? And some of our initial work, we had a program that was quite effective, but we only had one trainer. So in some sense, and that trainer happened to have exquisite context expertise, not just in mindfulness, but in the military setting in which the program was being offered. But now, with an eye towards scalability, what we ended up doing is sort of rebuilding a program sort of from the ground up with an eye toward being able to train up trainers in a much shorter period of time and not having the requirement of their existing mindfulness expertise. Because if they had the context expertise, our thinking was maybe with the learning of mindfulness skills, they would be able to implement with much more ease. And then we could scale up the availability of trainers for particular contexts. So I'm just going to fast track through this final study in which we developed this program, mindfulness-based attention training, learning from all this stuff I already told you about, 4 weeks, 8 hours. And in particular, what we were interested in doing after we designed it with this in mind was to see what would happen if we put people through a 10-week practicum and then have those individuals that have been trained to deliver it to actually go out and deliver it to active duty military service members under high stress intervals. So we wanted one group to have this context knowledge, context expertise, and we partnered with Army performance experts. So these are actually people that have performance psychology expertise, and we had them go through a practicum to learn how to deliver the training. And then, because we weren't sure what it would mean, we had actually somebody that had quite a lot of mindfulness expertise, somebody that had been delivering MBSR to community groups for many, many years, also go through that practicum. But this person had no background or knowledge of the military context. So coming in cold with the knowledge of mindfulness, broadly speaking, and mindfulness expertise, knowledge of the program and how to deliver it, but not about the group and the context. And our question was just not so much which one is better, but is it possible to train up people that know nothing about mindfulness but are very familiar with the context in this program and see beneficial effects on those that they train? And that's what I'm showing in this next slide. And again, you're invited, please check out the full study. What we saw is that with no training, same pattern, degradation over time. The mindfulness expert who learned how to train this program but knew nothing about the context actually looked no different than the no training group. But the group that was trained to deliver it and had context familiarity, this performance expert group, they showed stability and protective effects in attention over time. So to us, this was a very positive sign, and we've now gone on to look at many other contexts, more studies with military service members. We've trained military spouses to offer it to fellow spouses. We've now looked at training medical school faculty. This is a partnership project with Brown's Medical School to deliver it to medical students. And then in the business setting, we've offered the practicum to HR professionals to deliver it in high demand businesses in which there are seasonal sales cycles and high demand intervals as well. So we're back to where we started. Hopefully all of this is ringing a bell from where we began, that we now know that yes, attention and working memory are indeed vulnerable. Mindfulness training, broadly speaking, can protect against these vulnerabilities. And there are routes by which we can offer this training in a way that is feasible, scalable, and that really holds up, at least in our hands, to the test of comparison with other comparison programs. And I'll just end by thanking all of you for your attention. Thank you.
What a great presentation. Thank you so much for presenting your findings. I love the way that you contextualized what mindfulness was within mental time travel, and especially as that relates to those high demand intervals. We'll now open the floor to discussion. So you can type your question in the chat or the Q&A. You may also raise your hand to get mic access to ask your question. We have about 15 minutes left of discussion, so we'll probably get to a handful of questions. And someone asked about the recording for this talk. It will be posted on the center website shortly thereafter if you want to rewatch or share it. I actually want to start off the discussion by asking my own question about the first part of your presentation, where you discussed the impacts of negative distractions on that N170 ERP marker. I'm wondering if the way that you interpret that finding where you see the attentional lapse in the presence of that negative stimuli, do you think that the people are paying more attention to the scenes instead of the faces because you're priming them with this negative information, which is maybe more salient evolutionarily to our system than the neutral stimuli? Or do you just see it as, you know, taking away from their attention capabilities altogether?
Just so you're aware, we have so many different kinds of negative stimuli. They're not always complex scenes that would prime them in that way. So I don't think, I mean, those are the kinds of really good questions that reviewers asked us too. So we had to go back and really check and characterize the nature of our distractors. So it does not seem to be the case that it's driven by the nature of the negative stimulus. In fact, I'm pretty sure, there's been a while now, but that we had to go back and parse if we saw complex scene type distractors versus not, and we see a difference in the magnitude of the N170 effect, and it was absent in both cases. So it's a good hunch, but when we look at it carefully, it does not seem to be that's what's driving it. It's something more, we think, something more broadly affecting just the engagement in perceptual processing, more generally speaking. It's like they're hijacked away and they're not even processing it, the face scene combo image as robustly.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. I just was thinking about. Okay, and then there was one question in the Q&A that I saw that was more about the second part of your presentation. And it was not so much about the minimum effective training regimen, but how far or how long you think mindfulness session benefits last after a particular mindfulness session. So they asked, would mindfulness during an attention network test improve performance to a greater extent than a 15-minute mindfulness practice before that same attentional test? And I'm not sure if you have studies to answer this question, but.
Yeah, so that's a very different kind of an approach, right? That's more like, what is the punctate in the moment impact of engaging in these practices? And there are studies that have been done doing what I would call mindfulness inductions, not really mindfulness training studies. And there is evidence that those inductions will benefit people in terms of their acute sort of in the moment attentional performance. I don't know what the mechanism is there, because part of my interest is in really seeing, this is all the work that I've shown you so far is almost like step one to show that there are beneficial effects of in going through a multi-week program on one-time performance that we'll see after the training is over. What we'd love to see is what are the neural changes as that's happening. We've just not been able to partner with a group that will both let us work with them in high demand and bring fMRI and ERP into the picture as much as we'd like. So if we have both the consequences on performance, meaning benefits to performance, and neural changes, that's a much stronger case that mechanistically it's the training that is changing neural functioning, neural structure potentially, and information processing in the favor of the direction that we're seeing the behavioral benefits. With mindfulness inductions, I think it would be interesting to see how more studies may be comparing what they're calling inductions of mindfulness to something like a mood manipulation. So what you might call a mindfulness induction actually may be increasing mood, and maybe it's, if you'd given them happy music to listen to, you may have seen a beneficial effect as well. So it's the mechanistic aspect that I think inductions leave me with a big question mark. So yes, the answer is yes, people call them mindfulness inductions, and yes, they can have beneficial effects. I would say I don't know why they're getting them necessarily, because there's no real training effect that you might see in one 15-minute session, though it could be beneficial.
Right, it definitely seems like a different mechanism, and would need a different study design to probe into that further.
It may be a different mechanism is my hunch, yeah.
Okay, and now we have someone who has raised their hand and would like to ask a question over the mic. This is Effie Stavrilaki. Sorry if I butchered your name. I will allow you to talk right now. You will need to unmute your mic.
Yes, I am muted. Thank you. This was a fascinating talk. I also put my question in the chat, so you just so you're aware of that. So I have two questions. First is, what is it about mindfulness that helps attention so much relative to relaxation, say? Because usually, even the basics of mindfulness in the beginning even induce some kind of relaxation state as well. So that's a very interesting question to me. And then the next part is, why would a context-specific instructor help?
Okay, both excellent questions. So let me get at the first one of time is short, even though I probably went for an hour and 15 minutes to answer your first question regarding why would it be? What are the hypotheses regarding why I thought mindfulness training may be something we should apply for attentional functioning? And I mentioned it kind of in broad strokes regarding this mental time travel, this notion of perceptual decoupling that occurs during mind wandering. And if we can reduce mind wandering and reduce perceptual decoupling, we may be able to increase present-centered attention, which may help you get more information about the task you're trying to do and help your performance. But even when we break down sort of practice by practice in a mindfulness suite, it ends up, now let's just take something as simple but not easy, as a mindfulness of breath practice, where the instruction is to focus on breath-related sensations, pick a particular anchor, notice when your mind has wandered away from that anchor, and then redirect attention back. In some sense, we're already tapping into all of these major systems of attention and working memory by the simple set of instructions of focusing, picking a target and having the flashlight point to it, noticing, sort of having this observation salience detection regarding what our mind is doing, and in particular honing in on mind wandering, and then redirecting, remembering the goal of what we're attempting to do. So one set of hypotheses really are that in these practices, we are exercising each of these components of attention. And in exercising them, we're improving their capacity to function with regularity and in a controlled manner. So that's one prediction of why it occurs. And in terms of your question regarding relaxation and why relaxation may be different, in some sense, the relaxation training that, at least the conditions that we describe in the relaxation program, weren't aiming to bolster attention, it was using attention. So direct your attention to your big toe. Now to manipulate the experience that you're having, really tighten up the foot or relax it, and then move through the body. So there are ways in which that the use of attention is not intending to exercise it in the same way. So, these are still sort of open questions. You mentioned that you think, why would it be different? Because mindfulness always can also make you feel relaxed. I would say that is highly debatable. There are many practice sessions I've had where my session did not feel relaxing at all, though I felt like I was present-centered to maybe the chaos that was my mind in that moment. So I think these are great questions to continue pursuing, but at least in the initial studies that we've done, we're seeing that just these two comparisons of mindfulness versus relaxation do not tend to show the same kind of patterns. They could have, but they didn't. So that suggests it's worthy to pursue different mechanisms. You had a second question, which was regarding why the context familiarity matters for the trainers, right?
Yes, great attention.
So, this was one of the things that we were also very interested in, because these groups are not, the groups that we're working with are typically workplace groups. There is a mission, whether it's to put out a fire, get good grades, pass medical school, be an excellent nurse, critical care nurse, or be an excellent soldier, whatever it is. The orientation and the pressures are very much tied around the professional excellence kind of perspective. And there's a cyclical nature of the demands. So our thinking was that if we had people that already knew all of that, they knew the culture, they knew the norms, they knew the things that were important to people and the challenges that they were likely to face, we didn't have to train any of that. That came already baked into the trainer, him or herself. And now we could train them in the core mindfulness practices and program. They would contextualize just in the way that they would guide the conversation, so it would hit each of those points of interest for the participants. And that's really what we were seeing in our context familiar trainers. I mentioned that with military spouses, for example, we would get comments when it was outsiders like us coming in, like, this seems like it'd be helpful, but I need somebody that knows what my life is like. Like, you have no idea what it feels like to have a spouse that's deployed. It's almost like you have no clue, like what we're talking about and what our mind is. But instead, when they're talking to a spouse who does know exactly that lived experience, and when we're talking about the distractibility and the preoccupation and the weight of that on our functioning, there's a connection there with the trainer and a trust that what this person is telling me and the way in which they're guiding me may be something I should look into further. So in some sense, it's a way to expedite the interest that participants may have, and pointing to the utility in those particular contexts for why mindfulness training could be beneficial. Hopefully that answered your questions, Effie.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, thank you for your questions. Okay, and I think we'll probably have time for one more. And I see a series of questions from Amida Sadiq, sorry. And they said, thank you, great presentations. Are there any special considerations for delivering mindfulness-based attention therapies to people with ongoing negative stimuli, like doctors and nurses in palliative care? And they also followed up wondering if your studies have been primarily in Western cultures, and if there could be if the beneficial effects or the approach needs to be altered for Eastern cultures.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this issue of kind of cultural specificity is very, very important. Our work has been primarily, I guess, in Western context. I mean, in the US, in New Zealand, and Australia so far, of countries that we've worked with. But it's going to be interesting because, especially with our military work, now we have military colleagues that are not only from Western countries that are interested in implementing mindfulness training in the way that I've described to you here, in their cultural context, obviously still a military context. So I think for sure there's going to be differences. There's always differences based on the culture. When you go from a firefighter to an undergraduate, there are differences in the kind of cultural instantiation and the norms, as I was saying a moment ago with the military spouses. So I would definitely have very respectful orientation toward culturally kind of embedded in a way that is appropriate. But you had another question regarding if there is something regarding these attention-based therapies that we have to keep in mind when people experience negative, specifically when there's like a high level of negative stuff happening. In some sense, we always have our eye on that. But what I'll tell you is that if we go in saying, you're probably really prone to trauma, and you're probably having a lot of depression and psychological challenges that are going to make you probably not be able to do your job well, because really you're in some sense suffering from a psychological illness. That is probably the best way to make sure they never talk to us again. So I'm just telling you repeatedly, even including medical professionals, by the way, unless the group identifies that as the reason they're coming to mindfulness practice, it tends not to be the motivating force for why they might engage. So a lot of our framing is sensitive to the fact that there's a high degree of negative stuff that will be experienced, and challenge that will be experienced. And we are on the lookout for any signs that there is active trauma, et cetera. We always work, for example, with our military colleagues. We always have the brigade surgeon involved. We have a psych triage team that's there. But the approach we take with most of the participants in all of these groups is, and we check for this obviously before we enroll them, is that they're psychologically healthy, within a normal range of psychological health. And the approach is, we're here to help you bolster the functions that you already have. We're here to help you be successful in the thing that you want to be successful in. And we're here to help you change potentially the way that you orient toward the challenges that your profession forces you to encounter repeatedly. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that we've learned a lot regarding how to best frame it to at least increase the chances of openness to hearing what we have to say, with an eye toward all these issues as well, because they're going to be there. I hope that answered your question.
It makes a lot of sense. And it also kind of parallels what you're saying about the context, the importance of context-dependent instructors, right? That's an automatic way to adjust the different cultures, whether it be ethnicity or role, job. All right, well, we have reached the end of our allotted time. I'm sorry I did not get to everyone's questions. I know there was a few still lingering out there, but I think we had a great presentation and discussion, and I'm so grateful I got to moderate it. All right, everyone, I hope you have a great day. I think that's all that has to be said at this point.
Everyone.
Right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Raul. Thanks, Emily.
Thank
Thank you, audience.